Hi, folks. Happy Tuesday. Welcome to Advisory. Hope you guys are enjoying your short week. No school on Friday, don't forget. Before we get started with our normal advisory lesson, I wanted to go over a couple of things, a couple of updates for you in regards to some things that we've talked about before, namely creating a professional email. I realized after we talked about how to write a professional email that it's possible that not everybody has a professional email address. And it's very difficult to use the Dallas ISD mail, as some of you are aware. And so if you don't already have a professional-ish or professional-sounding email account, this will help you maybe get started with that. These are the best practices when it comes to creating a professional-sounding personal email address. First, I would suggest to use Gmail. Now, there are other email sites out there that you could use, but Gmail is used most often in a lot of professional settings, and it also gives you access to the Google suite of apps, which can be very helpful in multiple settings, educational and professional. Number two is try not to use numbers. Sometimes when you're creating an email address, they will throw a couple of numbers in there just to make yours unique. Try to find other ways to make your email address unique rather than using numbers. Instead, use your name or variations of your name, and I'll show you an example of that here in just a moment. Number four, make it easy to pronounce, spell, and remember. If you have a complicated email address, you know that sometimes it can be difficult to share what that email address is with other people verbally or written down. So make it easy for yourself to remember and others to hear and spell out. Number five, if you need to, use a period or a hyphen to separate the words in your actual email address. I'll show you an example of how you could use your name uniquely to make a professional sounding email address. So here are some examples of what you can do with your name, some formats, and then how I use the format to make my own over here on the right column. You could go very simply first name, last name @gmail.com. Now there are apparently a lot of jcalls in the world because this one was not available to me. And so you might have to change it up by using your first name initial, a period, and then your last name. Or maybe your first name initial and then your last name without any punctuation. Maybe your first name and last name initial separated by a period. All of these are good possibilities. You can also use a hyphen. Something that is simple, easy to remember, and involves your name is the best course of action to creating a professional sounding email account. And you will need a professional email account eventually because, number one, you want to send things like resumes or scholarships from a professional sounding personal email account, not like the one that I showed you last week that was like Banjo Boy something or other, not the email address that you made in middle school, right? Take some time today or tomorrow to create this Gmail account if you don't already have a personal account that you use and check regularly. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about is the advisory suggestion box. Now, the advisory suggestion box can be found by going to your advisory homepage for your class. It's on all of the websites, so you can go to any of them, but remember that you can get to your own class's website by typing in bit.ly/Longhorn, and then whatever your grade is. Today we'll go with 11th, shout out juniors. Once you get to the homepage, you can go up here, and it's kind of hard to see on this one, but you click the word advisory, and it'll send you to this page. And then the first thing you see on the left here on the advisory page is the advisory suggestion box. This is an opportunity for you as students to contribute to what we go over during this time in advisory, what you want to learn more about, what you want to spend more time doing, things like that. It gives you an opportunity to say something that you enjoy and then something that you have a concern or a question about regarding advisory. And then at the bottom, it gives you an opportunity to give a suggestion. Now remember that the main focuses of advisory are social emotional learning, remember how to be a human being, academic skills building, how to be a good student in general, and then planning for the future. So if you have any suggestions under those three main umbrellas that we can do during advisory, please don't hesitate to fill this form out. I look at this at least weekly to see what it is you guys want to talk about in advisory. And then even if we don't get to it immediately, we will eventually get to it. Now, for our main topic today in advisory, what I really want to get back to is talking about conflict resolution. Today, we're focusing on the 4 questions that we were talking about in that first video with the fellow who talked like this. And we're going to talk about the scenario that you discussed and read in your advisory yesterday. For today's point, I really want to get one thing across, and that is that in any sort of conflict, you are in charge of you. Too often when we're in conflict, we want to win, or at least our culture tells us that if you have to win, you have to kill it, you have to defeat your opponent when it comes to conflict. And that's just not how things get done most effectively. Maybe it'll feel good for a second if you win a conversation, but ultimately you make someone else feel bad and you yourself don't grow as a person. So today I want to focus on the 4 questions that fellow talked about in that video a couple weeks back and how they might apply to taking personal responsibility ourselves. Now remember, these are the questions to ask if you find yourself in a disagreement with someone. Number 1, what is going on in their world? Number 2, what is important to them at this time? Number 3, am I listening to understand or listening to defend? And number 4, have I been clear about my perspective? These first 2 questions get us out of our own head and thinking about the thoughts and feelings of the other person in the conflict. This may not feel natural to you in the moment of the conflict because, again, our brains, our culture wants us to win the argument. You want others to ask questions about you and your perspective whenever you're in a conflict, right? A lot of the times when you're involved in a conflict, that's all you want from the other person is to understand you and your perspective. So if you model what that looks like in the conversation to them, hopefully they will follow your example. And I really like these second 2 questions because it causes us to look reflectively inside ourselves and accept responsibility for the things that we are saying and doing. When we make sure that we are listening to understand what the other person is trying to say rather than defend our own points, and when we make sure that we have been as clear as we can possibly be about what our perspective is, we have done all that is in our power to do. And as much as we want to maybe control how the other person is acting or thinking or win the argument, the truth is we can only control what we do, say, and think. And since it's up to us to regulate our own emotions and control ourselves in a conflict with someone, I want to give you some tools to do that next time you find yourself in conflict with another student or a teacher or someone else. Number 1, accept that conflict is natural and inevitable. This building is full of 2,000 plus relative strangers to each other. Everybody has their own perspective, everybody has their own set of experiences, and so it is very natural and inevitable that there are going to be some things that cause tension among the human beings in this building. Once you accept that some sort of conflict is definitely going to arise, you can be better prepared for it and control yourself more carefully when you're in those conversations. Number 2 is to be a calming agent. It's difficult to do this whenever you're in a conflict, especially if you feel strongly about your position. But you can still feel strongly about your position in the argument and remain calm so that the conversation goes smoothly. The second that either party in a conflict starts to escalate their emotions, things can get out of hand very quickly and nothing gets resolved. Number 3 is listen, listen, listen. Whatever the conflict may be about, it's important to listen to the other person's perspective, even if you think that perspective is crazy or out of line. Oftentimes, if someone on the other side of the conflict feels as though you are listening to them, then they are more likely to listen carefully to you whenever you explain your side of the conflict. Number 4 is to analyze the conflict objectively. Analyzing something objectively just means that you don't have any bias or emotion in your analysis. When you are actively in a conflict or when you think you might be in a conflict soon, it's important to take a step back to look at your perspective and the other person's perspective with as little bias as you can possibly use. Oftentimes, if we are successful at taking our own emotions out of the equation, then we are more likely to see the conflict clearly for what it actually is. Number 5 is to use neutral language. This just means to remain calm and respectful in your language that you use in the middle of a conflict. The second that you start using inflammatory language, like talking about the other person's mom or saying every curse word you can possibly think of, you escalate the situation to a new level and it's very difficult to get anything done. Number 6 is separate the person from the problem. This goes right in line with analyzing the conflict objectively. Think back to the example that we read yesterday. If Mrs. Smith, whenever she was talking to John about being late to class, was able to separate the person from the problem, she would probably realize that there is something else going on in this student's life that is causing them to be late, and it doesn't mean that they themselves are a bad kid. And on the other hand, if John was able to see Mrs. Smith as a human being just trying to do her job, then maybe he would have been less likely to get angry and upset when she was trying to tell him to go to class. He may realize then that she's not just a mean teacher, she's just a person trying to do her job. Once you set the person from the problem, both people in the conflict can work together to solve the problem rather than trying to make it someone else's fault that the problem is even there in the first place. And the final best practice I want to share with you when it comes to conflict is you can agree to disagree and then move on. Like we said, conflict is inevitable. There are going to be times where you butt heads with folks, and sometimes it is best to just say, you know what? You think that, I think this. I have separated the person from the problem, so I have no problem with you. Hopefully you have no problem with me. Maybe we should just move on. You can try again later, or maybe it's just not going to be something that gets resolved. And that's okay. If you remember nothing else from this video and from the last 2 days of conflict resolution work, just know this. You are in charge of you. As much as sometimes we would want someone to do something or not do something, we only have control over what we do, say, or think. It's certainly more difficult to accept this responsibility because it means that we actually have to grow. It means that we may not always get our way in conflicts. It means that sometimes we might have to be the bigger person. But the more you practice these things in conflict, the better you will become at conflict, and you may find that people are much more willing to listen to your perspective if they know that going into conflict with you is not going to be an explosive thing. That's all for me for today. You can go to the next slide to have the discussion there with your advisors. Thank you for watching, and as always, be good to yourself and others. We'll see you soon.